Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video, we are going to go ahead and readdress the steering stops for the silver car. So if you remember, we had the failed attempt where I tried to make these additions to the brackets that would have a bolt come out, touch the control arm, or not the control arm, but the hub rather, and not factoring in the change in geometry as the suspension goes through its travel. It didn't work. So I had to go back to the drawing board and came up with a better and much more effective solution to make this happen. So what we are going to do is to take these pieces of tubing that I had drilled out to the corresponding ID that matches up to the OD of the rack gear on the steering rack. So that means is if I take this piece of tubing, and if you see the steering rack in there, this piece of tube slides over top. And it's actually about 10 thousandths larger than the rack gear itself, which works out pretty nicely. So we're going to take these pieces of tubing and these large washers that I bought that are obviously thick washers, as well as the set screws and the other hardware that we got right there. And we are going to make adjustable internal I guess, steering stops for the steering rack. Now, limiting the travel at the rack itself, the change in geometry with the different positions in the suspension's travel does not matter, as the stop is stopped at the rack itself rather than its effectiveness being dictated by the position of the suspension. So if that didn't make sense, it will as we progress through this video, and we have a little bit of preliminary work to do before I can start building these things and getting them squared away. So the first order of business that we need to take care of is right here. So on this rack, we have this washer welded on that works as the steering stop for it currently. Now, we're not going to be using that because we need the stop in a different position, and we also need one on the other side. So we'll go ahead and I will turn the steering wheel to move the rack gear towards me or towards the passenger side. I can come in with the angle grinder or some sort of cutting tool, cut these tack welds and get this washer off, clean the rack up, and then we can put the inner tie rods back in. Or I guess we have to sleeve some stuff and do some other stuff before that. So let me just get this cut off and then we can move forward from there. After a little bit of cutting and grinding, we now have the washer off in two pieces. So that's done, and now we just need to come in here and grind any little residual nubs and what have you off of that portion of the steering rack. So you can see some of the debris left, and that will not allow the stop that I'm building to slide over the rack. So I'll clean that up and we can keep going forward with this. After a bit of grinding, we have this side of the rack prepped to accept our tubing. So obviously there's no more washer. The grinding is not the prettiest, but the most important part is the tube does fit on and more than meets our depth. And obviously we're not going to use the entire length of this tube. I'm going to cut a section out of it. I will drill a hole, run an M6x1 set screw into there with a lock nut, all that, and we'll be drilling and dimpling the rack gear to provide a place to actually allow the stop to do its job. So the next thing I need to do, or I guess I can start on this passenger side stop as nothing is really impeding the length that this tubing can be and the depth of which this stop goes on. So I can go ahead and make this stop, and then the driver's side is the side that will be a little bit more cumbersome. So let's go ahead, start making this passenger side stop, and then we can move on with the project. So another little point to make is about my washers. So the washer itself, these are roughly 938 thousandths ID as opposed to roughly 943 OD for the rack. So what that means is it almost goes on, but doesn't quite. So what we are going to do is to enlarge this hole with a chamfer bit. So I tried this with an extra one of these washers that I had, and it worked out pretty well. So all that we do is chamfer one side, chamfer the other, and where they meet in the center, it will actually enlarge the hole enough that it will slide over top of the outside of that rack gear. So I have this nice big chamfer bit right here that works perfectly well for it, and I'll have to clean off the bed of my drill press here, but we'll go ahead and drill one of these so it fits over top of the rack gear, and then we can figure out the length of our tubing and make this passenger side stop. And we have the first steering stop welded up. So as you saw, I rolled the positioner over, again, round welds, and probably a little bit easier to use the positioner and a little bit more effective from a time management standpoint than to sit and do little stitch welds to weld these two pieces together. So the next thing that we need to do is to put the steering rack back to its central position roughly, and slide this onto the rack gear and mark out where it needs to be dimpled for it to receive one of the set screws. So in order to do this, I need to leave my nuts that will be welded onto the body of, or nut rather, singular in this case, but that will be welded to the body of the stop. Need to leave that off for the time being, as my marker will not fit through the nut itself, let alone through the thickness of the tube for the steering stop. So I'll have to slide this onto the rack, connect the inner tie rods back, put the tires on, lower it to the ground, and then put it in its most compromised position, meaning the position where there is the most interference between the tire, or the greatest chance of interference between the tire and the downpipe on this side. And once I have that done, I can mark out where the rack needs to be drilled to accept the set screw. Then I can pull it back apart and I can weld the nut onto this, and this side will be done. We can move on to the next side. So let me go ahead, throw this onto the steering rack, and we can move forward from there. After putting the front of the Supra back together, we ended up getting very lucky with the size of the steering stop on this passenger side. So this is with the steering stop, and obviously we can't see it right now, but it is jammed between the outer tie rod, or the inner tie rod rather, the nut that spins it onto the rack gear itself, and the body of the rack. And at that point we have plenty of clearance. Maybe difficult to see, but let's see if I can get a better angle. Probably not, but we have what looks like at least an inch worth of clearance going into, or going between the tire and the downpipe on this side. So that is perfect, and it will never have any issue with running the tire into the downpipe. Clearance is solved on that passenger side. And most importantly, as opposed to the design that I tried to implement prior, this will have no issue with changes in suspension geometry in the scope of its steering travel, as I said earlier in the video. So I am thrilled with that, and I can go ahead and pull the rack boot back, mark out where I need to drill my dimple. I can drill the dimple and pull that stop back off, weld the nut onto it, and get it ready for it to be completed. So while I have the car in this state, I can raise it back up, turn it the opposite way, so that way we can check this driver's side and determine the position and the length and everything that the steering stop needs to be or can be on that side. So let me go ahead and do that, and then we can pull it back apart and start building this side, the driver's side, finish the passenger side up, and before long we will have completed steering stops for the Supra. We now have the stop installed on the driver's side. So obviously it is still loose. I do need to weld it on there still, but it is in position. And if I, oh, come on. Give me one moment. If I crank the wheel, turning what would be right if I were driving the car, it stops it right there, and plenty of room between the tire and the dry sump tank. So all is well there. So the only thing left to do at this point is to roll the welder over and to weld these stops onto the steering rack. So I'll have to be a little bit cautious as I'm doing this, as where I am welding is right where the threads enter the rack. So I'll have to be careful not to put too much heat into it, and probably do this little stitches by little stitches, just to make sure that I don't distort those threads and end up having the inner tie rod be stuck into the steering rack, as that would not be a good thing. But I'll go ahead, get organized, roll the welder over, we can get these welded in, and this project will be completed. And at this point, we have the steering stops welded onto the rack. So here's the passenger side, and I went ahead and patched up one of the grind marks that I put into it when I was removing the factory stop. Our new stop is on there, welded around as far as I could reach, and then it's plug welded as well. On the driver's side, have our washer on there, again welded around as far as I could, as these really don't need a ton of weld to hold them in place. They are on the steering rack. If the welds break, which I don't think they're going to, they'll still do their job. So not too concerned with that, but the stops are in place. So I'm going to put a little bit of grease on them to prevent rust, and to put some more grease in where the gears mesh here. Again, grease on this side just to prevent some rust. Then I can take my new clamps right here, install them, put the boots back in place, install them, and then this job will be complete. Excuse the water noise in the background. The water treatment system here in the shop is working now. It's doing its daily purge, but aside from that, the boots are back in their rightful homes. However, the clamps that I have are too small, or too large rather, to effectively clamp around the rack body there. So I'll have to go ahead and get smaller ones, or just get some regular band clamps, something along those lines. But The most important part is the steering stops are complete. Mark II, version 2 of them ended up working out perfectly. So all is squared away there, and that is one more item checked off the list for this car before it can be a moving vehicle again. So I'll go ahead and lower it down and show you what else we have going on with it. Under hood, nothing has changed here. I still have to build the AN lines for it. I still have to do all of the wiring for it, but that will be coming very soon, since now that the whole house debacle is over with, my money is free to spend again. At least some of it. You know, I don't exactly want to immediately default on my mortgage, but now I can actually allot some money for this thing to try to get it hopefully running before the end of the year. And don't hold me to that, but that is my rough goal at this point in time. So beyond that, I pulled the factory dash that I had modified out. Let me go ahead and lower the hood down so we can see better. But I pulled my factory dash out, as it was going to take much more work to get it fit properly as opposed to the fiberglass dash. So I have to make patch panels that go in these areas, one on the passenger side obviously, and one on the driver's side, since I did not have this dash when the cage went in. Otherwise the dash would have been installed prior to dropping the two A-pillar bars down through it. But these are the cards that we are dealt, so I will have to make some patch panels to kind of pretty those corners up, and then figure out a mounting solution to get this thing mounted in, as it is not mounted to anything. And beyond that, we need to figure out a new solution for the actual steering column. As the factory column, you can see this bolt here, those are the two cabin side, or the most cabin side, and there are two other bolts farther in there that hold the factory steering column up. Now, I could probably make this work with spacers, but I think the better option is going to be to buy something like a Motion Raceworks universal column kit, and to adapt that to this car, as I can drop that as low as I need to, which likely the shaft will come through somewhere in here and not impede my molding that I did for the race pack, and that will make it an overall better, cleaner system. Would have been cool to keep the factory column and still have tilt, be able to say that I have a tilt wheel in my race car, but it isn't going to work out that way, so I will have to order one of those as well. So thankfully those aren't terribly expensive, but that will be another problem to solve in the near future. Beyond that, we need to order the shifter and build a mounting plate that will go over top of the factory shifter hole and allow that to be housed. I'll end up using the factory center console, as that mates up and fits well with this fiberglass dash. And then obviously everything wiring related has to go in here when the dash is out, and that shouldn't be too bad to get everything mounted up. So realistically, we aren't too far from hearing this thing make some noise. I mean, the two big outstanding items are wiring and plumbing, as without electricity, no sensor data, no ECU, and if we have no sensor data, no ECU, we aren't going to know that the engine is running, and it isn't going to command fuel or spark, and without either of those two things, it can't suck air in, and you can't complete that trifecta in any way, shape, or form. So we need those, we need plumbing, so that way it has oil, it has fuel, has all of the necessary items, or all of the necessary fluids rather, to make it function and to do its thing. So those will be the next two big projects we'll be doing on the car, and hopefully we can do those before too long. But all of that long-windedness aside, that is going to be the end of this video. So as always, until next time, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I will see you guys in the next one.